Welcome to the second half of the Chapter 54 e-text notes on civil rights for U.S. history and honors U.S. history. This section is going to, or this version is going to cover sections E through I. Condensing the notes, there's a lot of information, but you don't need to know all of it, so we'll be getting to that shortly. We're going to pick up with Chapter 54, Section E. The first part of the chapter is in a different video. Chapter 54, Section E talks about the pains and gains, the good and the bad with the civil rights movement. Some are double, actually. So we'll start with the gains. James Meredith becomes the first African American to attend the University of Mississippi, 1962. James Meredith is very active in the civil rights movement. At one point, he is shot for his involvement. Another positive, Martin Luther King Jr., March on Washington, 1963, with his I Have a Dream speech. It was very influential in the civil rights movement. It's a watershed moment, very important. People mobilized behind that speech. It even got John F. Kennedy proposing a civil rights bill in 1963. Children's March in 1963, that's both a gain and a pain. Talked about this in the video from the first part of the chapter. Bull Connor, the police chief in Birmingham, turns the police dogs and the fire hoses on the kids who are marching peacefully. That unto itself was a pain, and that's why it's listed on both. Let me do this. It is a pain because of the loss and the violence towards the children, but it is a gain because the public gets behind civil rights. People see this on TV and realize, okay, this type of hatred and violence isn't happening in my town, but it's happening elsewhere. And that becomes a public relations bonus for the civil rights. That's why we're pushing nonviolence. As I get rid of these circles, it shows people that, they can, even though violence isn't happening in their areas, it's happening elsewhere, and you have to pass these laws. You have to do something because it's legitimately, there's violence, there's discrimination, there's segregation going on, there's hatred going on in other parts of the country. So it galvanizes people behind this movement. So 1963, JFK proposes a civil rights bill. Throughout the South, voter registration increases. They push for African Americans and others to register to vote. Spoiler alert. Later in 1963, JFK is assassinated in Dallas. So his vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, takes over. He pushes Kennedy's legacy. He strong-arms people. He was whether you like him or not, he was a great politician, great at getting people to do things that he wanted them to do. He pushes through the Civil Rights Act, and it's passed in 1964. We have some other things that happen. The 24th Amendment is passed, which outlaws poll taxes. 1965 Voting Rights Act. It outlaws literacy tests and works to ensure African-American voting rights and voting rights of the poor throughout the United States. These are passed. These are all considered gains. Some of the pains, the Ku Klux Klan, KKK, becomes more active. As people are pushing for civil rights and African-Americans are getting more rights, there's a pushback and the KKK becomes more active. Medgar Evers, a NAACP activist, a civil rights activist, is assassinated the night after JFK gives his speech about proposing the civil rights bill. As he returns home, people are waiting in the bushes and gun him down in his driveway. You have more and more church bombings throughout the South. So this violence springs up from the KKK and others that are pushing back against civil rights and pushing for keeping segregation as a status quo. Children's March, we talked about the violence already. We also mentioned JFK being assassinated, and these are some of the pains. Some of the other civil rights leaders are murdered. Later, also, you have people disappearing, being burned. You have other people, church bombings and such going on. Children being murdered and others being killed through the civil rights era also. So there are pains that go along with this. We're going to move on to Section F here in a second. So Section F deals specifically with Martin Luther King Jr. As I stated, he was a civil rights leader. He pushed for nonviolence. As my phone dings, he pushed for nonviolence. He studied under Gandhi. We talked about this in yesterday's video. Sorry, not situation, but video. And he advocated for nonviolence. He's a very charismatic civil rights leader. In 1968, he was assassinated, shot at his hotel. James Earl Ray was arrested and convicted for that murder of Martin Luther King Jr. Chapter 54, Section G. These are all individual pages on the web. Long hot summers through the late 60s and the early 70s. You had riots spring up in over 150 cities. Many of them were based upon racial issues. You also had anti-war protests coming online, with Vietnam becoming rather unpopular. And in some instances, Vietnam was not popular, but supported by other members of society. So you have these divides over generations, over political ideology, over I don't know if not necessarily nationalism, but patriotism, and over race. And you have a series of riots that break out in the late 60s into the early 70s. And it just adds to the chaos and the tensions in the country. Chapter 54, Section H, talks about Malcolm X, and he's a rather controversial figure. His stance changes. We'll get into that in a second. He becomes a member of the Nation of Islam while in prison. The second leader of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, sees Malcolm X speak. Very charismatic speaker, gets a following, brings him into the fold, pulls him in, and Malcolm X starts out as a separatist. He believes African Americans and whites should not live together. And his stance over time changes and causes a split with Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm X is eventually assassinated in 1965, so we don't know where he would have ended up on the spectrum. He started out as a counterweight to Martin Luther King Jr., stating that, pacifism and non-aggression, non-violence was not the way to go. Fight violence with violence. And then he did some soul searching, went to Mecca, studied Islam, came back with a different perspective, and he was killed before he could fully put that perspective into action. And the last part of the chapter 54, Section I, talks about Black Power, another controversial term. For many, it means pride in the culture, African American culture. At that time, you did not have very many shows. We talked about this previously in the 1950s. For those of you that were doing some of the projects, Nat King Cole was the first African American to have a television show, had his own television show. He couldn't get any sponsors because people were afraid of offending white America by sponsoring an African American, even though the show was popular. He couldn't get sponsors for the show. So you have this pride in culture. Diane Carroll, famous actress, she was the first African American woman to have her own show. She was played a single mom who was a nurse on television. You didn't have a lot of characters being portrayed on TV. So this was a push to have pride about one's culture. But then you have, I don't want to say the darker side, but you have more controversial aspects. Black Panther Party, they claimed their violence was in acts of self-defense. Other people claimed they were violently acting out. They claimed to be countering the violence towards African Americans. Others claimed they went too far. So you have this section where they talk about the two sides of the coin, if you will. Pride and culture versus violence and controversy. That wraps up Chapter 54, Section I. I know this is brief, but as we move through that part of the chapter, I only want you to have a brief overview of this information. We're not going deep with it. So I hope this helps, and we'll go from there. Have a good day, everybody. Any questions, please email me.